She greeted them like family. That's what every traveler wrote, those who left anything behind at all. That Evelyn Mallory stood barefoot on the porch of Bellstone Inn, arms folded in soft linen, hair tied in lavender ribbon, and a voice like the echo of childhood lullabies. That she smiled as if she'd known them forever. And beside her, always, stood Clara, silent, unmoving, dressed the same, with hands clasped too tightly, too still. Some said Clara blinked too little. Others said she didn't blink at all. It was 1837 in Bellstone, Arkansas. The stagecoach route ran through pine-locked hills, and Bellstone Inn was the last rest stop before the pass, a place where wheels cracked, horses collapsed, and people arrived more ghost than flesh. But those who passed through swore something healed inside them there. Not all could explain it. Some travelers described peaceful dreams they couldn't remember. Others woke with no memory of their illness or wounds. The inn gave them rest, comfort, food, and something else. Something few understood and fewer survived. You're going to want to hear all of this. So, if you're new here, subscribe and ring the bell. Stories like this are buried deep, some in history, some in dirt, and the deeper we go, the more they start to breathe again. If you felt the chill already, share and comment below. Because what we're about to uncover isn't just a story. It's a warning carved into the floorboards of a house that should have never been built. The first confirmed record of Bellstone Inn appears in the Crawford County Registry, filed on January 3, 1836. Listed owner, Mrs. Clara Mallory, widow of Judge Horace Mallory, deceased. It describes the property as a modest guest house built on inherited farmland, with 2 full bedrooms and adjoining quarters. But by the fall of 1837, regional maps mark the inn as a full lodging facility, able to house up to 12 guests. And by 1838, a local Baptist journal described it as the finest resting place south of the ridge, operated by the pious Sisters Mallory, who give without expecting return. That name, Sisters Mallory, would echo through the hills for years, except no official record ever lists Evelyn Mallory as a real person. The guest book for Bellstone Inn still exists, barely legible under the burn marks and mildew. Preserved in the Bellstone Historical Society vault, it contains names of those who stayed, dates, and short remarks left by guests. But what historians noticed was this: the same phrases appeared over and over across years in different handwriting. I slept better than I have in years. The soup brought something back to me. It felt like my mother was there. They loved me like they knew me. Some entries were crossed out, torn. One page had what looked like teeth marks. And then there are the letters, the few that made it out. One from a traveling salesman named Edgar Lormont, dated May 19, 1839, and addressed to his cousin in Memphis. They are kind in a way that burrows under the skin. I wept in my sleep and they told me it was grief leaving my body. But there's no music here, no birds. Even the wind seems to pause before it crosses their roof. Clara does not speak. Evelyn smiles too much. I cannot tell if they are old or young. They told me I was healing. I feel more buried each morning. That letter was never sent. It was found decades later in the lining of a trunk auctioned at a Memphis estate sale in 1903. And it wasn't the only one. From 1837 to 1844, exactly 40 guests checked in and were never seen again. The pattern was missed because they had no next of kin. They were widows, outcasts, runaways, veterans with no letters left to send. The sisters took them in, wrapped them in warmth and whispers, and the trail vanished. Until a child vanished. In November of 1844, a child named Tabitha Gray disappeared while traveling with her aunt. They had been passing through on a wagon from Fort Smith, heading east. The aunt was found a day later, hysterical, claiming she had no memory of the last 3 nights. Her hands were stained with white ash and flower petals. She kept repeating, "They sang to her. I thought it was a dream." Tabitha was never found, and yet Bellstone Inn remained. It remained as if no one noticed. As if the house itself bent time, bent memory, made the missing feel like fiction. Even the sheriff's logs from that year contain no mention of the child, though multiple letters from townsfolk reference the little one gone missing. It's as if the moment you tried to trace the sister's story, something pushed back, softly but firmly, like hands guiding you to bed. The only consistent piece of evidence was the soil. The garden behind Bellstone Inn bloomed unnaturally. Roses in frost, herbs in drought, vegetables with no pests. Travelers wrote about the strange peace that came over them near the vines. Children fell asleep under the lavender bush in minutes. One doctor remarked in his diary that the garden smelled like old churches and clean wounds. What he didn't know was that the earth was already full. The first whisper of what lay beneath didn't come from officials, but from a boy, a farmhand named Jonathan Pike, working on the neighboring property in 1852, said he had seen Evelyn planting something deep, wrapped in white, not moving. His uncle beat him for the lie. But Jonathan drew what he saw, a row of bed-shaped mounds with polished stones at the heads. His drawing, crumpled and blood-stained, ended up in the archives of Bellstone Elementary when the school was built nearby. They say he was found crying in the root cellar 3 days later. They say he forgot how to speak, and he never touched soil again. All of this, guest books, letters, drawings, whispers, lay buried until the 1920s, when restoration efforts unearthed something older than record-keeping. But that story, the one sealed under stone and shame, is only beginning to surface. Because Bellstone wasn't just a place people stayed. It was where they ended, and where something else began. It was a traveling preacher named Ezra Lockwood who first wrote the phrase, "The sisters who give comfort, but take something too." His journal, bound in cracked leather and water-stained from its time buried behind a crumbling chapel wall, was recovered in 1911 during the demolition of the old Bellstone Mission House. Though Lockwood had long faded from church memory, his writings would become the first documented suspicion that something was profoundly wrong at Bellstone Inn. The entry was dated October 2nd, 1839. I passed through Bellstone just as the leaves began their amber descent. Cold had not yet taken root in the soil, and yet I saw not a bird, nor fox, nor rabbit on that road. Silence, thick and wrong, clung to the pine. When I reached the inn, I was welcomed by Miss Evelyn Mallory, who spoke with gentleness I have heard only from the dying. She called her sister Clara, who stood in the doorway, unmoving. I offered scripture. Evelyn offered soup, and I ate it, though I now wish I had not. Lockwood's writing grew erratic after that date. His scripture references turned cryptic. Psalms were overwritten with the symbols, what some believed to be a hybrid of Latin, Greek, and an unknown glyphic language. But most chilling was the list he kept. 40 names written in the back of the journal. Some were full, some only initials. All of them had vanished between 1837 and 1844. He titled the list, "Those Who Were Loved Too Deeply." That phrase would echo again. In 1876, an elderly midwife named Martha Crane confessed on her deathbed that she had once tended to a woman who birthed twins inside Bellstone Inn. She said it was not a guest, but one of the sisters, though she couldn't say which. The labor was strange. quiet. No pain, no screams, just the steady, unnatural rhythm of humming from Evelyn. Martha claimed the babies were born too still, and Clara had taken them without a word, swaddled them in what looked like wedding lace, and buried them in the garden that same night. The bodies were never found, but in the garden logs preserved by the Bellstone Gardening Society, a short-lived organization from the 1850s that cataloged plant varieties in the region, there is one entry that stands out. 2 bellflowers bloomed overnight beside the lavender mound. Unusual, white-veined petals. Fragrance not identifiable. They only lasted 2 days. Then there are the artifacts. In 1962, before the site was condemned, a team of amateur local historians entered the remnants of Bellstone Inn. The house had partially collapsed, leaving the northeast corner exposed to weather and time. Inside, they found the remains of what they described as a blessed room, a kind of sacred guest chamber containing personal items of past lodgers, a monogrammed handkerchief, a baby's rattle, a worn soldier's cap, and a single shoe with dried blood inside. Beneath a loose floorboard, they found a letter that read, "I'm not afraid of dying here. I'm afraid I'll be remembered wrong. They say I am broken, but she looks at me like I'm whole. I want to stay, even if I sink." The letter was unsigned, dated 1840. This was not the voice of someone imprisoned. This was a voice speaking from inside a spell, a ritual of mercy twisted into something possessive. Bellstone didn't take people in and devour them. It transformed them, made them part of its design. That is the difference between cruelty and something far more terrifying, devotional hunger. And yet, despite the dozens of missing, no charges were ever brought against Clara or Evelyn. No lawman ever crossed the threshold with intent to arrest. Sheriff Daniels of Crawford County at the time wrote only one line in his 1845 notebook. "I reckon it's better they stay put. We all got ghosts. Best some stay buried." But there were signs others tried. In 1851, a physician from Little Rock named Dr. Isaac Monroe traveled to Bellstone after hearing rumors of unnatural healing and a place where widows forget their grief. His notes, preserved in the Arkansas Medical Curiosities Archive, described what he called a restorative fugue state in guests who entered Bellstone and lost all symptoms of grief-related ailments within hours. But what disturbed him most wasn't the guests. It was the sisters. He wrote that Evelyn spoke to him with knowledge of his past he had not shared, and that Clara placed her hand on his chest and whispered, "Yours beats too fast. It always has." He had suffered from a congenital arrhythmia. No one knew. He left Bellstone the next morning and scribbled the words, "They know what we hide," over 20 times in the margins of his diary. 3 weeks later, he suffered a cardiac arrest while sleepwalking. His body was found facing north toward Bellstone. As more letters surfaced in the early 20th century, a strange pattern emerged. Those who left Bellstone often dreamed of returning, even if they never consciously intended to. Some reportedly boarded the wrong trains, wrote letters to the sisters without realizing it, or spoke their names in sleep. Several accounts describe dreamscapes in which Clara or Evelyn stood beside a bed, hands folded, eyes open, asking gently, "Would you like to be known?" It was that phrase, "to be known," that appeared again and again, in letters, in journals, on scratched pieces of wood recovered from the ruins. Some guests had arrived shattered, by war, by loss, by hunger. They came to Bellstone as empty vessels, and the sisters filled them with something unnameable, but complete. Too complete. And once filled, they didn't leave. Not truly. A modern researcher named Beatrice Langley, who spent a decade reconstructing the Bellstone timeline, concluded in her 2020 dissertation, Bellstone was not an inn. It was a vessel for unresolved humanity, a cathedral for the undone. The Mallory sisters did not harm their guests. They harvested the pain they could not express elsewhere. They built something holy out of emptiness, and then they buried it so it could bloom. Which leads us to the mounds. In 1924, a repair crew attempting to stabilize the southern perimeter of the Bellstone ruins uncovered precisely 40 burial sites, all lined with white stones, all equidistant. There were no coffins, no markers, but each grave had within it a small object, a lock of hair, a poem, a bone carved with unfamiliar markings, a folded note with phrases like, "She held my name in her hands. I forgot how to ache. This is where I become." The earth was undisturbed above them. The roots grew around the graves as if instructed, as if the garden had learned. And now, the pattern is returning. Reports of humming in the pines, a girl who drew a house she'd never seen, with 2 women at the door, people waking from sleep with lavender in their mouths. Bellstone is waking, not from memory but from ritual. Because what was buried wasn't just bodies, it was love given without permission. And love, when uninvited, does not die, it waits. The first to count the graves was not a historian, not a sheriff, not a preacher, it was a cartographer. Thomas Aldwych, a government surveyor mapping mineral routes through Crawford County in 1924, was the one who first documented the symmetrical field just south of the Bellstone ruins. His initial report was dry: coordinates, elevation, soil composition. But the second page included a hand-drawn diagram of the graves. He labeled them simply 40 depressions, identical spacing, north-facing. He didn't sleep the night after the discovery. In his field journal, found decades later in a cedar chest in his grandson's attic, Aldwych wrote something strange. It feels intentional, like the earth was taught how to bury. No signs of digging, just resting, like the ground was told to remember. He returned to the site the next day with a measuring rod and a compass. What he found disturbed him. The graves were not only identical in shape and spacing, they formed a pattern, a geometric spiral coiling inward toward what would have been the inn's original hearthstone. He marked the center point with a red flag, but when he came back the next morning, the flag was gone. In its place was a single white feather, upright in the soil. He never returned to Bellstone again. But that map, his drawing of the spiral, would resurface in 1961, tucked inside a crate of misfiled land surveys at the Arkansas Geological Archives. The archivist who found it noticed something else: small, smudged ink at the bottom corner, a phrase written in Aldwich's script. They didn't just bury them, they arranged them. So the question became, who were they? Who were these 40 names erased from time, scattered in hearsay, never logged, never missed? Bellstone's guest book, damaged and half-burnt, offered fragments. Names barely legible: R. Ashcroft, E. Lantine, Miss Prudence, Mother with 3, and sometimes just initials, scratched in trembling script. Many entries ended not with signatures but blessings: "Thank you for seeing me. You gave me back my breath." She called me by my real name. Some names match up with missing persons notices from neighboring states. Others appear in travel manifests for stage routes that passed Bellstone between 1837 and 1844. But here's the chilling part. In every case where a guest disappeared, their traveling companions survived, but with no memory of the inn. One such case was Samuel Farrow, a tinsmith from Missouri who traveled with his sister Anne in the spring of 1839. Anne was reportedly ill. Wasting, they called it. She could barely stand. According to Samuel's later testimony, they found Bellstone Inn by grace alone and stayed for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, Samuel awoke in the woods, 30 miles east, sitting upright on a wagon that wasn't his, with no memory of how he got there. Anne was gone. He returned to Bellstone, he insists he did, but he found only an abandoned clearing. No inn, no sisters, no garden, he told the sheriff. The sheriff laughed. Years later, Samuel would write to the Fort Smith Tribune in a letter never published. "My sister died, that I know, but the way they looked at her, I swear she was healed. I watched her walk without pain for the first time since she was a child. Evelyn held her like a daughter. And then, nothing. I remember nothing, just her voice saying, 'She knows your sorrow. She can carry it.'" There were others. A war widow from Louisiana, traveling under the name Mrs. D. She wrote in her journal about the room where prayers were whispered through the walls and the bathwater turned warm without fire. She vanished in 1841. A child named Elsie, age 10, last seen with her uncle en route to Van Buren. The uncle reported losing time near the hills. The child was never found. A peddler, a widow, a mute boy, an escaped convict, a woman with a birthmark shaped like a key. 40 total, vanishing in the same 6-year window. But this wasn't random. This was selection. They were broken, hurt, abandoned. The kind of people you might call unfortunate. The ones society forgets. The ones who want to be remembered. And the Mallory sisters gave them that. Not in name, but in placement, in ritual. Each guest was given a bed, a bath, a meal of root stew and warm bread. They were asked the same 3 questions, recorded in multiple letters across decades. What have you lost? Who still knows you? Would you like to be remembered just once, exactly as you are? Answer all 3 and you stayed. That was the contract. What happened after varied. Some were reportedly asked to sleep in a special room lined with mirrors. Others were placed in the garden to smell the roots until something stirs. One man was instructed to write his entire life story on a ribbon and bury it under the porch. A woman was asked to scream her father's name into a jar and seal it with wax. These rituals were never explained, but always, it ended in silence. The last thing most guests did was sing, a single note, held until their breath failed. No one knows why. In 1983, a paranormal researcher named Colin Dorsey attempted to recreate the Bellstone rituals in a controlled environment using actors and recovered script fragments. Over a 3-day immersion, one of the participants, playing the role of Clara, fell unconscious after reciting the phrase, "I welcome the ache of another." She could not explain how she knew the line. When revived, she spoke a sentence in an unknown tongue, matching the phonetics of the Mallory inscriptions found under Bellstone's floorboards. She later claimed she felt as though something was placed inside her chest, humming softly. She left the project, burned her journals, moved to Maine. Some say she hums to herself in sleep. Today, the Bellstone field remains sealed, technically private property, owned by a real estate firm that refuses to list it. Visitors report headaches, loss of time, and the faint scent of lavender. Drones flown over the grave spiral often malfunction. But satellite images taken at dusk show something disturbing. The pattern shifts. Not dramatically, but subtly, imperceptibly, as though the graves are adjusting, aligning, waiting. And at the center of the spiral, beneath what would have been the hearth, grass refuses to grow. The soil remains exposed, soft, warm to the touch. No one has dug there, yet, but those who get too close say they hear something just beneath the surface. Not a voice, not a cry. but a breath. The first survivor to come forward wasn't believed. Her name was Miriam Croft, born in 1824 and raised in Boone County, Missouri. She was a school teacher who traveled alone to Arkansas in the summer of 1841, intending to visit her cousin in Van Buren. She never made it. Instead, she arrived weeks later in Little Rock, barefoot and shaking, with no recollection of how she'd gotten there. Her clothes were torn at the hem, but otherwise clean. Her hands were bruised, her right cheek scraped, and the inside of her mouth had been stitched shut with silk thread, crudely, but with surgical precision. The thread had dissolved on its own. She didn't speak for a month. When she did, her first words were, she sang while she stitched. The doctors assumed madness, a result of trauma, perhaps a robbery or assault along the route. Miriam herself offered no narrative for what had happened, only fragments delivered slowly over years. But in 1859, she finally sat down with Reverend Lyle Hendricks and gave him a single-page testimony. He kept it hidden for decades. It was found inside the cover of his Bible after his death. Miriam wrote, "I was taken in by kindness, fed without asking, heard laughter I did not share. I walked into a room that was not mine and saw myself sitting by the fire. But it wasn't me. She moved like me, smiled like me. But she wasn't waiting to be saved. She was waiting to stay. I screamed. That was when Clara came with the thread." Miriam had stayed at Bellstone for 3 days. She recalled Evelyn preparing her a bath infused with rosemary and milk. Clara sat by the doorway and never spoke. The water turned cold without explanation. The soap left no scent. The windows of the guest room would not open. The third night, she dreamed of a room filled with beds, each with a figure beneath a quilt, motionless. Above each bed hung a painting of the same two women, holding a ribbon stretched between their mouths. The ribbons were red. She awoke to find herself on the garden path, barefoot, with a red thread tied around her left wrist. She ran. The fact that she lived was considered miracle enough, but over time, Miriam's health deteriorated. She never married, never taught again, and spoke rarely. Her final letter, written in 1893, contains one line worth remembering. "They weren't killing, they were folding, like linen, neat and warm and silent." But Miriam was not the only one who survived. There was also Jonas March, a logger from Oklahoma Territory who lodged at Bellstone for a single night in 1843. He arrived with a broken ankle and a missing thumb, both injuries from a bear trap gone wrong. He told friends he expected to die in that place, but when he returned home, both wounds were healed. Perfectly, unnaturally. The bone had set as though months had passed. The skin on his hand bore no scarring. What he remembered, however, was far stranger. Jonas claimed the sisters never touched him. He saw them only in reflections, in a basin of water, in a cracked window pane, once in the mirrored eye of a taxidermied fox above the hearth. But their voices filled his head, soft and warm, like lullabies spoken through thick fog. He swore they asked him questions he didn't understand. Do you still want what you lost? Would you be someone else if the ache could be erased? If your pain had a mouth, what would it say? He answered aloud. He didn't remember what he said. But when he woke, the pain was gone, the wounds gone. He left without looking back, but others couldn't, not even in death. A grave record from 1854 lists a woman named Temperance Rowe, age 27, buried in Little Rock. The headstone reads only, "She remembered the song." No one could explain the epitaph, but in 2003, the grave was exhumed as part of a citywide preservation project. The body inside was not Temperance. It was male, roughly 60 years old. and in the mouth of the skeleton was a rolled ribbon of parchment. The ribbon was red. On it, in faded ink, was a prayer. I did not die, I was softened. Let them fold me again. Who wrote it remains unknown. There is a theory, one whispered by archivists, researchers, those who've chased the Mallory legacy through ink stains and scorched floorboards, that Bellstone Inn wasn't a place where people died. It was where they were translated. Not killed, not abducted, transfigured. Turned from flesh into memory, into feeling, into something the Mallory sisters could carry and arrange. Because that's what Bellstone was. A collection. Each grave, a chapter. Each guest, a page that bled ink when opened. They weren't buried to be forgotten. They were buried to be read. Evelyn Mallory was said to speak to each guest alone before their final night. Clara remained silent, watching from the doorway. The room was dim, the bed always turned down, the hearth lit without wood. Evelyn would ask one question: "Do you want to stay loved?" And if they said yes, the door would close. The next morning, the bed would be empty. But never cold, the sheets always warm. There's a consistency in the way guests were described after their arrival: calmer, slower, more reverent. As if something inside them was being reshaped, like grief being melted down and poured into a new mold. They spoke in present tense even when recalling pain. They cried without expression. One man recited poetry he didn't know. A child drew symbols in the dirt, identical to the ones found beneath Bellstone's foundation. The transformation was gentle, too gentle. Because when kindness becomes formula, when love becomes ritual, it stops being mercy and becomes something else entirely. The Mallory sisters didn't kill. They relieved, they rewrote. And for those who stayed, their lives were not ended, but archived. In warm rooms, in soil arranged like sentences. In the spiral that draws inward, forever inward, toward the place where Evelyn once whispered, "The heart only breaks to become readable." People today still claim to hear the songs. They come to the edge of the field, press their palms to the ground and feel a vibration. Faint, like breath. Others report dreams. A woman in Georgia wakes to the smell of rosemary and milk. A child in Ohio draws a house he's never seen. A man in Kansas writes love letters to a woman named Clara he insists he met last week, though she died in 1861. Each time, the pattern repeats. They feel seen, known, understood too deeply, and then they vanish. No missing persons report, no body, just a silence shaped like a name, folded neatly, left in the dark. The fire that revealed the bodies began without flame. In August of 1927, a lightning storm tore across the Ozarks. Dry heat surged through the pine forest and winds howled against Bellstone Ridge like a chorus of wolves. That night, locals reported an eerie orange glow above the tree line. No flames, no smoke, just light, hovering like the flicker of lanterns long extinguished. But what they found the next morning was no trick of the weather. Bellstone Inn, what remained of it, was gone. Not collapsed, not burned. Gone. The foundation stones were still there, blackened and cracked, but the wood had vanished. No ash, no debris, only soil freshly turned, as if the house had folded into itself, drawn downward into the earth like a curtain pulled shut. At the center of the ruin was a perfect circle of scorched grass, and inside it exactly 43 depressions. Not 40. 43. Until that moment, the number had always been 40. The number on Aldwich's map, the number echoed in guest records, the number of missing remembered only by whispers. But now, 3 more graves had appeared, forming a tighter spiral near the hearthstone. And at the center, where no grave had ever been before, was a pit, 4 feet wide, empty, except for a bundle of red thread, carefully knotted and wrapped in muslin. It was warm to the touch. Sheriff Isaac Crowley was the first to examine the site. A veteran, stoic and grounded, not given to superstition. He took measurements, photographs, sent for soil analysis. But after 3 days, he walked away from the case entirely. When pressed by reporters, he said only, "They weren't buried there. They were arranged there. There's a difference." The land was fenced off within the week. Ownership transferred quietly to a private holding company in Illinois. The company dissolved 6 months later. No new owner was ever registered, but the fences remain. Locals call it the fold, but they don't go near it. Because in the months following the storm, strange things began to happen in Bellstone Hollow. Children dreamed of women in lavender. Horses refused to cross the ridge. Seeds wouldn't sprout in the soil. Radios picked up static that pulsed like breathing. And then, in November, a letter arrived at the Crawford County Post Office addressed only to the one who remembers. It contained a list of names, 43 of them. Each name matched a known traveler who had disappeared between 1837 and 1844, plus 3 that had never appeared in any records. Evelyn Mallory, Clara Mallory, Tabitha Gray, Tabitha, the child who vanished. There was no return address, but the postmark came from Bellstone. The town no longer existed. So who sent it? That question would drive Dr. Ellery Haynes nearly mad. A linguist and folklorist from the University of Chicago, Haynes had spent years cataloging rural superstitions of the American South, what he called functioning folklore, meaning beliefs that affected behavior even without proof. In 1932, he arrived in Arkansas to investigate the Mallory case. He brought with him journals, photographs, sound recording equipment, and a graduate assistant named Lila Mays. He left alone. Haynes interviewed over 40 local elders, each with varying degrees of recollection. Most dismissed the sisters as old ghost stories. Some, however, offered chillingly consistent details, descriptions of songs sung with no mouth, of feathers found inside closed windows, and of dreams where the inn stood whole again, lanterns lit, chimney smoking. But it was Lila who found the phrase. Etched faintly into the underside of a pew at the long-abandoned Bellstone Chapel, written in old cursive, barely visible beneath dust and moss, "Those who are folded must be read aloud once more." She showed it to Haynes. They argued about it. Lila believed it was a warning. Haynes believed it was an invitation. That night, he returned to the chapel alone. He was found 3 days later in the Bellstone field, standing at the center of the spiral, barefoot and humming. His feet were blistered, his eyes unfocused. His lips moved, but no sound came. When he could speak again, he said only this: "I was read, she folded me, but she left my name unwritten." He never published again. Lila left Arkansas and changed her name. The recordings they made were confiscated by the university, but one survived. A scratchy wax cylinder mislabeled as River Chant 1899 surfaced in a private collector's archive in 1987. It contains 43 seconds of sound, a woman's voice, soft and slow, singing a lullaby in a language no one has yet identified. Linguists claim the phonemes are real, but from no known root. Mathematicians, oddly enough, discovered that the syllables follow a Fibonacci sequence. And audio engineers? They found something stranger. Beneath the voice, layered so faintly it borders on imperceptible, is the sound of breathing, 43 breaths. Exactly. In rhythm. The collector who uncovered the recording, an antiquarian named Melinda Ray, played it only once before destroying the cylinder. She claimed the voice knew her name. Not guessed it, knew it. That night, she wrote a final note before leaving town. I felt the fold. I wasn't lost. I was remembered. No one has seen her since. So now we return to the number. 43. 3 more than before. The implication is terrifying. Evelyn and Clara, folded into their own archive. Tabitha, the one child who was meant to be forgotten. But if that's true, then who made the fold? Who wrote the list? Who maintained the spiral? Who still hums the song beneath the soil? There's a final theory, whispered, never published, that Bellstone Inn was never built, that it was not a place on a map, but a place in memory, a shared threshold for those ready to surrender their pain, that the Mallory sisters were not women, but metaphors made flesh, archetypes, echoes of every face that ever offered comfort without cost, that they were love given form, and that such love always demands a shape to hold it. A spiral, a thread, a grave, or maybe a story. And if that's true, then every time we speak their names, every time we remember those who vanished, we open the fold again, just a little, just enough. And if we go any deeper, we may not come back out the same. They returned in pieces, not flesh. No one ever saw that again. But signs, echoes, fragments that slipped back into the world like folded letters slipped beneath a locked door. It began quietly in 1933, 6 years after the Bellstone disappearance. A locket was found in the hollow, unburied, lying on a patch of frost-kissed grass where no frost should have been. Inside the locket was a hand-painted miniature of a girl in a lavender dress. No name, no signature. But the image matched the only known sketch of Clara Mallory. The locket was warm. The local who found it, Reuben Calhoun, brought it home to his wife. She wore it once. She died in her sleep that night. A peaceful expression on her face and blood pooled in the shape of a spiral under her pillow. There were no wounds. Their daughter, age 6, said her mother had been taken back. Back where? No one asked. Because what followed was far more terrifying. Objects continued appearing. A monogrammed glove, size too small for any adult, embroidered with the initials T.G., Tabitha Gray. A china teacup with the hairline cracks that resembled handwriting. The words it spelled, if you trace them, were, "I remember your voice." A woolen shawl with no tag, no wear, and a scent of milk and lavender that lingered for months. All of them were found on or near the Bellstone property. All of them were warm. All of them were dry, even in rain. And all of them disappeared again. Without witnesses. Without explanation. The townsfolk stopped taking them home. They left them on porches, on fences, on church steps, and one by one the objects faded. But those who touched them said the same thing. It felt like someone was about to speak. In 1942, during the war, an Army reconnaissance flight passed over Bellstone Ridge. The pilot, Lieutenant Hugh Wallace, reported a cluster of old structures visible from the air, timber-framed, symmetrical, too pristine to be ruins. He filed a report. The next week, the same area was surveyed by foot. Nothing was found. Wallace retracted his statement, but not before he drew what he saw. An inn, a chapel, a garden, and 43 stone markers arranged in a spiral. What's strange is this: the drawing wasn't made in ink. He used red thread dipped in water. The following year, 2 hikers, Anna and Luke Flanders, twins from Little Rock, went missing in the same area. Their parents received 2 letters a week later, postmarked Bellstone, Arkansas. The town had not existed for nearly 80 years. Each letter contained the same phrase: "We are safe. The inn is warm. We are finally known." No handwriting was recognized. The letters were written in identical cursive. No fingerprint analysis was possible. The paper repelled oils. The family moved north and never spoke of it again. But stories like that accumulate. They don't rot or disappear. They accumulate like dust behind a sealed door, harmless until it opens. And that door opened again in 1964. A restoration team from the Arkansas Historical Commission petitioned to excavate the Bellstone site. They were denied federal funding, but one private donor, anonymous, supplied enough money to move forward. 3 archaeologists began work in April. They lasted 2 days. On the first day, they cleared the brush, discovered a foundation stone engraved with something like musical notation, not notes exactly, but glyphs shaped like mouths in varying expressions. That night, one of the team members, Dr. Grace Murdoch, recorded in her journal, "The air feels rehearsed, as if it's waiting for a cue." On the second day, they dug beneath the foundation. 6 feet down, they hit wood. Polished mahogany. Not rotted, not cracked, still warm. They called it a substructure, theorizing that Bellstone Inn had been built atop a much older building. They prepared to uncover it. That night, Dr. Murdoch vanished from her tent. No prints, no struggle, only a folded piece of paper on her cot. A single sentence: "I have remembered you in full." The dig was halted. The site was reburied. But Murdoch's disappearance ignited new interest. That same year, an article appeared in a niche folklore journal titled The Folded House, a living archive in Southern Gothic memory. It outlined a theory not unlike what Ellery Haynes once hinted, that certain places absorb grief not by accident, but by design, that they are built, consciously or not, to become receptacles for the unspoken, the unloved, the unnamed. The author used the pseudonym E.M. Gray. The initials matched both Evelyn Mallory and Tabitha Gray. The article ended with an unsettling suggestion. What if Bellstone Inn was not a place people went to escape pain, but a place that pain created to house itself? That would explain why the spiral remains even as the building fades, why the number always returns to 43, why nothing stays buried. Because Bellstone was never a building. It was never even a memory. It was a need. Given walls, a roof, a hearth, and names: Clara and Evelyn, hostesses, caretakers, vessels. And if that's true, then the question isn't whether Bellstone will return. It's whether we need it to. The world has no shortage of the unloved, the overlooked, the weary who ache to be known, even once, by name. Maybe that ache shapes things, shapes soil, shapes houses, shapes sisters with hands too still, and voices that speak only in dreams. Maybe that's what every traveler felt in their bones as they approached that porch. Not warmth, not comfort. Recognition. And when the door opened, it didn't matter what they'd come looking for. Bellstone knew what they'd lost, and it gave it back, just long enough to take it away again. Softly, completely, like folding linen, it was always the red thread. Woven into shawls, hidden beneath floorboards, tied around letters with no stamps. It appeared again and again, not as decoration, but as boundary, as if the Mallory sisters had marked the edge between memory and forgetting with something soft enough not to scare, but strong enough to bind. And when the red thread appeared again in 2003, it was no longer confined to Bellstone. It showed up in San Marcos, Texas, wrapped around the wrist of a child found wandering a dry riverbed. The boy was nonverbal. His name, origin, and parents were never discovered, but every night he sat cross-legged on the floor and traced spirals into the dust with his finger. 43 loops, always 43. When asked why, he pointed to his chest and whispered, "She remembers me." In Maine, a man checking into a hospice facility handed the nurse a box. Inside was a tightly coiled bundle of red thread and a small linen journal. Every page was filled with drawings of an inn. Not one inn, but many, all the same shape, all with a spiral garden in the back. He died that night. The thread remained warm. Even in death, these remnants bled outward. Emissaries from a place the world refused to believe still pulsed beneath its feet. But there was no denying it anymore. Bellstone had outgrown the hollow. It had become portable. In 2011, a graduate student named Rowan Leith began a thesis on spatial hauntings. Not places haunted by people, but people haunted by places they had never been. Bellstone was case study 1. The archive included newspaper clippings, eyewitness interviews, and 2 audio files. One, labeled Innkeeper, featured a woman's voice saying over and over, "You may leave your name or your sorrow, not both." The other was subtler, just breathing, 43 breaths. Again, Rowan never finished the thesis. Their apartment was found empty, but taped to the wall, above the desk, was a map of the United States with 43 red pins. Each one corresponded to a documented appearance of the red thread. Next to the map was a sticky note that said, "She's building annexes." Because what if Bellstone was never meant to stay in Arkansas? What if it was always a migrating memory, seeking cracks in the world where the grieving gather? What if it was never a building at all, but a pattern? A way of arranging the forgotten into something beautiful before taking them home? And if that's true, then the Mallory sisters aren't ghosts. They're librarians, preserving moments no one else would keep. In 2017, a woman named Sylvia Carson went viral on social media after posting a photograph of her grandmother's house in rural Kentucky. The photo seemed ordinary, an old woman on a porch. But in the background, inside the window, a figure in lavender stood completely still, hand raised in what looked like a wave. Sylvia had no siblings, no cousins, no one living in the house at the time. Within hours, hundreds of people commented, many claiming to recognize the figure, not by name, but by sensation. I saw her outside my dorm once. She offered me tea on the side of the road in 1994. She touched my cheek when I tried to overdose. Always the same woman, always in lavender. Sylvia deleted the post, but not before someone enhanced the photo and found, reflected faintly in the glass, the spiral. Then the dreamers returned. People began reporting dreams of an inn with no walls, a place where sorrow floated like dust in shafts of amber light, where hands were warm and names were sung instead of spoken, and every time the guests numbered 43. Never more, never less. One woman woke with a name on her lips, a name she'd never heard before, and discovered it belonged to her stillborn sister, never spoken of in the family. Another man reported dreaming of holding a letter he never wrote. A letter that ended with, "Please remember me fully, even if it hurts." The pain was the price, and Bellstone accepted payment. In 2022, a symposium of folklorists convened in Asheville, North Carolina. Topic: Contemporary lore and the emotional architecture of haunted spaces. One speaker, Dr. Henrietta Ames, delivered a paper titled "The Folded House, a Functioning Pattern of Empathetic Erasure." Her claim was simple: Bellstone was real, but not geographically. It was a repeating event, a psychic software that installs itself wherever the right emotional conditions are met. Shame, longing, isolation, love withheld. Once present, the pattern forms. Red thread, spiral, lavender, 43. And the Mallory sisters, now myth, now memory, serve as anchors, not evil, not angelic, just bound to the role we've given them, keepers of the unwanted version of ourselves, the ones we hide, the ones we loved too much to face, the ones we almost were. And somewhere beneath it all, the spiral waits to be filled again. Because every few years, someone goes missing near a field that doesn't exist on any map. And when they do, no one remembers their name right away. But they remember the warmth of their last hug, the smell of their pillow, the sound of their laugh, and eventually, that memory folds into silence. That's when Bellstone reaches out, not with fear, not with force, with welcome. And in that welcome is the truth that terrifies us most. There is a place for everything you thought you lost. It just might cost you the name you used to find it. There's a letter archived at the University of Arkansas, yellowed by time, and never publicly displayed. It's unsigned, no date, no envelope, just a folded page tucked between two outdated land ledgers found during a routine digitization of the Bellstone region records. No one knows who wrote it or how it got there, but the handwriting matches none of the clerks from any era. It reads, "I wasn't supposed to stay, but she asked me so softly, asked me if I wanted to be held where I was still whole, and I forgot what I came to find. Because here, I am not missing." Archivists mark the letter as anonymous folklore, but one note in the margin, written in pencil, catches the eye. Initial ink analysis. Traced iron from Mallory inkstone formula, pre-1850. Mallory inkstone, that was real, used by Evelyn and Clara in their guest registry, a book which has never been recovered. That registry is one of the last unresolved artifacts of Bellstone Inn. 43 names were once written in it, but the names weren't of the guests. They were of the people the guests had lost. Because Bellstone didn't just take you in, it mirrored your grief back at you. Not to torment, to offer reunion. You were given one evening, sometimes just an hour, where that which you could never hold again became whole, warm, and waiting. A father gone too soon, seated at the hearth. A child miscarried, now giggling in the corridor. A friend who left a letter unfinished, now laughing from the staircase. And when you looked into their eyes, they remembered you, completely, as if no sorrow had ever broken the bond. And then the spiral took its due. You could leave Bellstone, but something stayed behind. Your name, your ache, the exact flavor of your silence. That's what Evelyn and Clara Mallory preserved. Not bodies. Versions. Every visitor gave them a piece, and in return, they received an echo that sang with warmth instead of regret. Until the pattern filled, 43, and the house folded. But that wasn't the end. Bellstone was never a fixed place. It became a code. A whisper passed through red thread, woven into maps, dreams, lullabies, forgotten songs, stray pets who seem to recognize you even if you don't. And now the pattern opens again. You're not the first to hear this story, and you won't be the last. But there's a reason you stayed through it. Because something in you aches like it remembers being offered a place, a room, a hand, a porch light that didn't wait for your name before it turned on. That's how it begins. That's how Bellstone rebuilds. One memory at a time, one wound freshly refelt, one person wondering where they lost the version of themselves that didn't have to perform for love. That's when the thread finds you. A note in a coat pocket you don't remember writing. A song you hum before realizing you never learned it. A spiral drawn absent-mindedly into condensation on the glass. The invitation never comes with words. It comes with warmth, because Bellstone isn't a curse. It's a response to forgetting, to sorrow discarded in the name of survival, to all the versions of you that once wept into a pillow and begged, quietly, foolishly, to be seen without having to explain. The world didn't offer that. So Clara and Evelyn did. And if you're quiet now, if you let the silence stretch just a little longer than is comfortable, you might feel it. The warmth behind your ribs. The hollow that isn't quite empty. The sense that someone, somewhere, still knows the name you whispered to no one. The name you gave your grief when it first broke loose inside you. That's the name they remember. That's the name Bellstone files away, in a drawer that never locks, under a sky that never scolds. And that's where you'll go if you ever return. Not to be taken, not to be devoured, to be included. Folded into a pattern that doesn't ask for anything but truth. Your truth. Unvarnished, uncured, unforgotten. So, if one day you walk a road you don't recognize and come upon an inn you never booked, with lanterns that flicker like they've been waiting, don't be afraid. You've already been there. You were just too hurt to remember. Now, you're whole enough to be welcomed. 42 have come before you. And tonight the spiral opens again. Not for death, not for haunting, for completion. So go ahead. Step up to the door. It already knows the weight of your footsteps. And behind it, someone is still waiting with a hand outstretched. Not to stop you, but to say, "We remember you fully. Come inside. We saved your place."